The first ball of the Ashworth season fell on a Thursday in late April, and Eleanor Hartwell stood at the far wall of the gilded room in a gown she had turned twice at the seams. Around her, the season's new diamonds moved in clouds of white silk and seed pearls, their dance cards already marked in 3 hands, their mothers positioned at the edges of the floor like artillery. The chandeliers threw light across bare shoulders and jeweled throats and the polished parquet where couples turned in careful geometry. Eleanor did not have a dance card. She had not been offered one at the door. Her sister Frances had pressed her own card into Eleanor's gloved hand in the carriage and whispered, "Hold it as though someone gave it to you." And Eleanor had smiled and said nothing, because Frances meant well, and because the card was blank, and because a blank card held correctly still looked like a blank card. The room had already decided what she was. She had heard it twice since arriving, once from a woman in garnets who had not troubled to lower her voice. A wallflower? The word had a kind of botanical gentleness to it, as though the condition were seasonal and would pass. It would not pass. She was 24, plain-featured, the third daughter of a dead baronet who had left nothing behind him except debts and a name that no longer opened doors. She had no dowry, no connections, and no reason to be in this room except that Frances's husband, Mr. Crawley, had been given 4 tickets and could not in conscience leave his wife's sister at home while the rest of the household dressed for the evening. So Eleanor stood at the wall and held the blank card and watched the season unfold without her. She did not see the Duke of Thornfield stop walking. He had been crossing the ballroom toward the terrace, his path a straight diagonal that the crowd opened for without being asked. Edmund Ashworth, the 5th Duke of Thornfield, was 32 years old, 6 feet and 1 inch of silence in a black coat. And he had not danced at a public ball in 3 years. The ton knew why. His wife, Margaret, had died of a fever in the winter of 1811, and the Duke had returned from London 2 days too late to hold her hand. He did not speak of it. He did not need to. The fact of his mourning preceded him into every room like a draught under a door, and the mothers who positioned their daughters along his probable path did so with the careful optimism of women who believed that grief, like a season, eventually turned. He had been walking toward the terrace. He stopped. His gaze had caught on something at the far wall, something still and upright and wearing a gown the color of rain, and for a span of 2 full seconds, the Duke of Thornfield stood in the middle of his own ballroom and looked at Eleanor Hartwell as though he had never seen a woman stand alone before. Then he resumed walking. The terrace doors closed behind him. Eleanor did not notice. She was watching the dancers and thinking about the price of candles, which had risen again, and whether Frances could afford the 2nd evening this week, and whether it mattered, since no one would ask her to dance at the 2nd evening either. If you have ever stood at the edge of a room and felt the particular weight of being unseen, stay close. This story knows that weight, and it knows what happens when someone finally crosses the room. Eleanor's life in the Crawley household was not unkind. It was merely small. Frances loved her, in the distracted way of a woman with 3 children under 6, and a husband whose legal practice kept him in chambers until dark. Mr. Crawley was decent and dull and embarrassed by Eleanor's presence at his table, in the way that decent, dull men are embarrassed by obligations they cannot discharge and cannot refuse. He paid for her meals. He did not pay for her gowns. The gown she had worn to the Ashworth ball had been Frances's before the 3rd pregnancy, and Eleanor had taken it apart at the bodice and rebuilt it with a panel of gray silk she had found in a remnant bin on Bond Street for 4pence. The result was serviceable. It was not beautiful. The shoes she wore beneath it had been resoled twice, and the left heel sat a 1/4 inch lower than the right, so that she walked with a faint unevenness she had learned to disguise by moving slowly. She moved slowly through most of her days. She rose at 6, dressed the children when the nursemaid was occupied, read to the youngest until breakfast, helped Frances with correspondence, walked to the lending library when the weather permitted, mended what needed mending, and went to bed at 9 with a candle she had bought with her own coins, which were few and carefully counted. She had been living this way for 18 months, since her father, Sir Edward Hartwell, had died at his desk in the study of the house in Wiltshire that was no longer theirs. The debts had swallowed the house, the furnishings, the horses, the small portrait of her mother that had hung above the mantel in the morning room. Eleanor had kept one thing, a miniature of her mother, no larger than a playing card, painted on ivory and framed in thin brass. She kept it in the pocket of her day dress, where its weight sat against her hip like a handheld. That same week, in the withdrawing room at Thornfield House, the Dowager Duchess of Thornfield set down her teacup and addressed Lady Cecilia Fenwick with the calm authority of a woman who had never been contradicted in a room she owned. "The Hartwell girl was at the ball," she said, "the Wallflower, standing at the eastern wall in a turned gown. I cannot imagine who admitted her." Lady Cecilia, who was 22 and golden-haired, and had been introduced to the Duke of Thornfield at 3 separate events without producing more than a bow from him, smiled with the particular patience of a woman who had been told since childhood that she was the correct choice. "I believe she came with the Crawleys," Lady Cecilia said. "The Crawleys?" The dowager's mouth thinned. "Henry Crawley is a solicitor's son. His wife was a Hartwell, which was something once. It is not something now." She turned the conversation to the supper arrangements for the garden party the following week, and Eleanor Hartwell's name was set down in the dowager's mind beside a verdict that required no further evidence. The garden party at Thornfield House was held on the first Saturday in May, and Eleanor attended because Frances had been invited, and because Frances could not leave Eleanor behind without acknowledging aloud that Eleanor had nowhere else to go. The gardens were formal and immense, laid out in the French style with gravel paths and clipped yew and a long terrace where the guests gathered around small tables set with white linen. Eleanor wore the gray gown again. She stood near the edge of the terrace and held a glass of lemonade she did not drink, and she watched the Duke of Thornfield move through his guests with the controlled economy of a man who found his own hospitality exhausting. He came to her at the far end of the terrace, where the gravel met the lawn and the yew hedge blocked the wind. "Miss Hartwell." She turned. He was closer than she had expected, and the proximity registered in her body before her mind could account for it. A warmth along her neck, a sudden awareness of the exact distance between his shoulder and hers, which was less than 2 feet and more than propriety preferred. "Your Grace." "You are not eating," he said. "I am not hungry." "Sit down, Miss Hartwell. You look pale." It was not an invitation. It was a command, delivered in a voice so level it might have been discussing the weather. And Eleanor sat because her knees had gone unreliable, and because the alternative was to remain standing in front of a man whose gaze felt like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. He did not sit. He stood beside the stone bench where she had lowered herself and looked out across the garden, as though he were surveying a field he intended to purchase. "You were at the ball," he said. "I was." "You did not dance." "No one asked me." The sentence came out before she could soften it, plain and factual and stripped of the careful deflection she had learned to wrap around the truth. She felt the heat rise in her face. He did not turn his head. His jaw, which was carved along lines that suggested a man who had decided long ago what his face would do and permitted no deviation, did not move. "No," he said, his voice low. They did not. He walked away. Eleanor sat on the bench and pressed her palms flat against the cold stone and breathed until the warmth in her face subsided. Her pulse was visible in her wrists. She watched it, and did not understand it, and did not try. That afternoon, while the guests gathered around the refreshment tables and the Dowager Duchess presided over a discussion of the charity concert planned for June, Eleanor noticed a girl of perhaps 14 standing alone at the far corner of the garden. The girl wore a dress of printed cotton that was clean and pressed and entirely wrong for the occasion. Her hands were clasped in front of her, as though she were waiting to be examined. Eleanor recognized the posture. She had worn it herself for 18 months. She crossed the garden. The girl's name was Hannah Briggs, and her father was a wool merchant who had supplied fabric to the Thornfield estate for 20 years and had been invited, Eleanor suspected, because someone on the Duke's staff had been told to fill the garden and had cast the net wider than the Dowager would have preferred. Hannah was terrified. Her eyes were wide and fixed on the gravel at her feet, and her voice, when she spoke, was barely audible above the wind. Eleanor asked her about the wool trade. She asked her about her younger brothers, whose names were Thomas and William, and about the gray cat that lived in the counting house. She stood between Hannah and the terrace so that the girl's back was to the crowd, and the crowd's assessment could not reach her face. They talked for 20 minutes. By the end, Hannah was laughing about the cat, which had once knocked an entire ledger into the coal scuttle, and Eleanor was smiling in a way she had not smiled since the house in Wiltshire. Edmund Ashworth stood at the library window on the first floor of Thornfield House and watched them. He had not intended to watch. He had gone to the library to retrieve a letter from his steward, and the window faced the garden, and the woman in the gray gown had crossed his line of sight at the precise moment he looked down. He watched her place herself between the merchant's daughter and the terrace, with the deliberate positioning of a person who understood what it meant to be exposed to a room's judgment. He watched her lean forward to hear the girl's voice, one hand steady on the stone balustrade, her head tilted at the angle people use when they are listening with their whole attention, rather than waiting for their turn to speak. He watched her smile, and the smile did something to the structure of his chest that he did not examine. It was not the smile she used at formal gatherings, the careful, measured expression that cost nothing and revealed nothing. It was wider and less guarded and slightly lopsided, and it changed the geometry of her face in a way that made him step closer to the glass. His hand went to his breast pocket, where a folded letter sat against his ribs. Margaret's handwriting. The last letter she had written, the morning the fever came, addressed to him in London. Never received in time. He had carried it for 2 years and 4 months. He pressed his fingers against the fold and turned away from the window. At the refreshment tables, Lady Cecilia Fenwick found Eleanor refilling her glass. "Miss Hartwell," she said, and her smile was the particular smile of a woman who could afford to be kind because her position was unassailable. "I see you have found a companion. The merchant's girl." She glanced toward the far corner where Hannah was now standing with her father. "I would not worry. Wallflowers have their own quiet corner, do they not?" The words landed the way all precisely aimed words land, in the soft place between the ribs where composure lives. Eleanor held her glass steady and said, "Miss Briggs is excellent company." "I am sure she is," Lady Cecilia said, and moved away. The following Thursday, at a small evening concert held at Lady Redisham's house in Mayfair, Eleanor sat at the back of the room beside Frances and listened to a soprano perform an aria from an Italian opera whose name she did not catch. The Duke of Thornfield sat 4 rows ahead of her, on the aisle. She could see the line of his shoulder, and the set of his jaw, and the place where his dark hair met the collar of his coat. She watched these things because the alternative was the soprano, and because her body, which had developed a traitorous facility for locating Edmund Ashworth in any room he occupied, would not permit her to look elsewhere. At the interval, he found her in the corridor, where she had gone to avoid the crush in the drawing room. He stood 2 feet from her and looked at her with eyes that were gray and level and unreadable in the way that deep water is unreadable, which is to say that the surface was calm and the movement was beneath. "You play," he said. "I beg your pardon?" "The pianoforte. Lady Redisham told me. She heard you once at your father's house in Wiltshire. That was years ago. Do you still play?" "When there is an instrument." "Which there is not, at the Crawleys." He was quiet. His hand moved to his breast pocket and stopped. She saw the movement and did not understand it. The way a person sees a bird change direction mid-flight and registers the change without knowing what startled it. "There is one at Thornfield House," he said. "In the music room. It is not used." "Your Grace, I could not possibly." "It is not an invitation, Miss Hartwell. It is a fact. There is a pianoforte in the music room. It is not used. You play. The 2 facts seem to me to be in poor arrangement." He walked away. Eleanor stood in the corridor with her back against the cold plaster and her heart beating in the base of her throat, and her hands, which had been steady all evening, trembling at her sides. She went to Thornfield House on Tuesday. Mrs. Linford, the old housekeeper who had been at the estate since the previous Duke's time, admitted her through the side entrance and led her to the music room on the 2nd floor. The corridor smelled of beeswax and old wood, and the particular stillness of rooms that have not been opened in a long time. Mrs. Linford unlocked the door and stepped back, and Eleanor walked in and stopped. The pianoforte was a broadwood, rosewood, and ivory. Tuned recently, standing in a shaft of morning light near a window that overlooked the square. A thin layer of dust covered the lid, except at one end, where someone had wiped it clean with a cloth and left the cloth folded on the windowsill. Eleanor sat down. The bench was cold through the thin fabric of her day dress. She placed her fingers on the keys and felt the familiar weight of the action beneath them, the slight resistance that a good instrument offers before it gives, and she played. She played a sonata she had memorized at 15, and then a country air her mother had taught her, and then something she did not have a name for, something that came from the place in her chest where 18 months of silence and service and careful counting had accumulated into a pressure she could not release any other way. She played for an hour. She did not know that Edmund Ashworth had come home early from his solicitor and was standing in the corridor outside the music room with his hand flat against the doorframe and his eyes closed. He did not enter. He stood and listened and pressed his fingers against the folded letter in his breast pocket, and when she finished, he walked to his study and sat at his desk and did not move for a long time. He had loved Margaret. He had loved her with the steady devotion of a man who understood that love was not a feeling expressed in the body, but a commitment maintained in daily act. He had married her when he was 27, and she was 23, and they had lived at Thornfield together for 2 years and 9 months. And she had been happy. And he had believed that happiness was a durable thing, the kind of thing a man could build around a woman and expect to hold. The fever had come in January. A message had been sent to London, to his rooms at the Albany. But the roads were iced, and the rider had been delayed. And by the time Edmund reached Thornfield, Margaret had been dead for 6 hours. She had written him a letter that morning, before the fever worsened. The housekeeper had found it on her writing desk, sealed and addressed in her careful hand. He had opened it in the bedroom where she had died, standing beside the bed that still held the shape of her, and the letter said only this: that she was feeling poorly, that Mrs. Linford was fussing, that the snowdrops had come up in the south garden, and that she missed him. She missed him. He had folded the letter and placed it in his breast pocket, and he had not removed it since. 2 years. 4 months. The paper was soft now along the creases, and the ink had faded where his thumb pressed against the first line when he reached for it in moments he could not otherwise navigate. He did not speak of Margaret. He did not need to. The letter lived against his chest like a second heartbeat, and the world saw only the coldness that had settled over him in the months after her death, the refusal to dance, the minimal speech, the distance he maintained from every room he entered. The world saw a man preserved in ice. It did not see the river moving beneath. If Eleanor's quiet dignity has already settled somewhere in your chest, you might consider pressing the like button or leaving a word in the comments. These stories find their audience when someone takes that small step. The weeks that followed were a slow accumulation. Eleanor returned to the music room at Thornfield House on 3 more Tuesdays, always admitted by Mrs. Linford, always alone. On the 3rd visit, she found a vase of fresh-cut snowdrops on the pianoforte's lid, though the season for snowdrops had passed weeks earlier. She did not know who had placed them there. She touched the white petals with one finger and sat down and played. On the 4th visit, Edmund was in the entrance hall when she arrived. He did not explain his presence. He walked with her to the music room in silence. And when she sat at the instrument, he stood near the window and watched the square below as though her presence in his house were an unremarkable fact of the afternoon. "Play the country air," he said. "The one you played the first time. You heard that? I hear everything in this house, Miss Hartwell." She played. Her hands knew the notes. Her mind was occupied entirely with the man at the window, whose breathing she could hear in the pauses between phrases. When she finished, he turned from the window and looked at her, and his face, which she had come to read the way a sailor reads weather, was doing something she had not seen before. The ice was thinner. The surface had cracked in a single line that ran from his mouth to his eyes, and what she saw beneath it was not coldness. It was attention. Specific, focused, unwavering attention, the kind a man gives to something he has recognized as necessary. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "Your Grace." "Eleanor." Her name in his voice. She had not heard anyone outside her family use it in 18 months. The 2 syllables moved through the room like a hand extended. Her breath stopped. Her fingers, still resting on the keys, pressed down on nothing, and a single low note sounded in the silence. He left the room. She sat at the pianoforte with her hands in her lap, and her pulse visible in her throat, and the sound of her own name still moving through her like a current. She could not stop. The Dowager Duchess had not been idle. She had watched her son's movements with the precision of a woman who understood that power was not held by confrontation, but by arrangement. She had observed the Tuesday visits. She had noted the snowdrops. She had spoken to Mrs. Linford, who had told her nothing, and to Lady Cecilia's mother, who had told her everything she wished to hear. The plan was simple. At the midsummer ball, which the Ashworth family hosted each year, and which was the season's final great event, the Dowager would announce Edmund's engagement to Lady Cecilia. The announcement would be made in front of 300 guests. Edmund, who avoided public scenes with the discipline of a man who had learned that grief and spectacle were poor partners, would not contradict his mother in front of the assembled ton. The engagement would stand. Lady Cecilia would become the Duchess of Thornfield. The Wallflower, the turned gown, the blank dance card, the country air played on a Tuesday morning in a room no one was meant to enter, would vanish back into the small life from which they had briefly emerged. Eleanor heard the rumor at Lady Redisham's breakfast table 3 days before the ball. A woman she did not know, speaking to a woman she half recognized, mentioned the Duke of Thornfield and Lady Cecilia Fenwick in the same sentence, and with the particular brightness that accompanies intelligence, the speaker believes to be confirmed. "The announcement is to be Thursday," the woman said. "At the midsummer ball. The Dowager arranged it." "And the Wallflower? The one who has been calling at Thornfield on Tuesdays?" Still here, I am told, though I cannot imagine why. The season will not have her. Eleanor set down her teacup. Her hand was steady. The rest of her was not. She left the breakfast table and walked to the Crawleys' house and climbed the stairs to the room that was hers, only because Frances had insisted, and she sat on the bed and pressed her mother's miniature against her chest and breathed until the pressure behind her eyes subsided. She would go to the ball. She would not go to the ball. She would write to him. She could not write to him. She had nothing to write. She was a wallflower, a dependent, a woman in a turned gown whose name had been spoken aloud in his house exactly once, and the fact that his voice had made her name sound like something worth carrying did not change the architecture of the world, which had been designed for women like Lady Cecilia, and not for women like Eleanor Hartwell. She went to the ball. She wore the gray gown. Frances had offered to lend her a white one, but Eleanor had refused, because the gray gown was hers, and because she had rebuilt it with her own hands, and because if this was to be the last evening she spent in a room with Edmund Ashworth, she would spend it as herself. She pinned her mother's miniature inside the waistband where it sat against her hip, and she laced her shoes, the ones with the uneven heels. And she did not look in the mirror because the mirror would show her what the season had always shown her, and she already knew. The ballroom at Thornfield House was lit by 400 candles in crystal chandeliers, and the crowd was the largest Eleanor had ever stood inside, and the noise was a single sustained chord of laughter and music and glass against glass. She found her usual position at the eastern wall, the same stretch of plaster she had stood against at the first ball in April, and she held herself still and watched the room arrange itself around the evening's purpose. The Dowager Duchess stood at the head of the room in dark blue silk and diamonds. Lady Cecilia stood beside her in white, her hair dressed with pearls, her smile calibrated to suggest both modesty and confidence. Edmund was not yet in the room. At 9:30, the Dowager stepped forward and raised her hand, and the orchestra ceased, and the room turned toward her with the collective attention of an audience that had paid for its seats and expected a performance. "It is my great pleasure," the Dowager said, "to share with you this evening the news that my son, the Duke of Thornfield, is to be married. His engagement to Lady Cecilia Fenwick will be formally announced in tomorrow's papers." The room exhaled. Applause began at the edges and moved inward. Lady Cecilia inclined her head. The Dowager smiled the smile of a woman whose arrangements had held. Eleanor stood at the eastern wall and felt the floor tilt beneath her. Her hand found the wall behind her and pressed flat against the plaster. The blank dance card, which she had carried out of habit, and which Frances had again pressed upon her in the carriage, slipped from her other hand and landed on the parquet face down. She did not pick it up. She did not leave. She had come as herself, and she would stay as herself. She straightened her spine and released the wall and crossed the ballroom floor, past the turned heads and the lifted fans, past the Dowager and past Lady Cecilia, to the corridor that led to the music room. She climbed the stairs. She opened the door. The Broadwood sat in the dark, the vase of snowdrops replaced by a vase of white roses that someone had placed there since her last visit. She sat down at the instrument and placed her hands on the keys and did not play. She waited. When the door opened behind her, she did not turn. She knew the sound of his step. She had learned it on 4 Tuesday mornings. The particular weight of his stride. The pause before he entered a room. The quality of the silence he carried with him. "Your Grace," she said, "your mother has made an announcement." "I am aware." "Is it true?" "It is not." She turned. He stood in the doorway in the black coat, and his face was doing the thing she had seen at the pianoforte, the crack in the ice, the movement beneath. Only now the crack had widened, and what she saw was not merely attention. It was need. It was the held breath of a man who had carried a dead woman's letter against his chest for 2 years and 4 months, and who had heard a living woman play a country air in a room that had been silent since the day his wife died, and who understood, finally, with the slow certainty of a man who did not arrive at his conclusions quickly, that the letter and the music were not enemies, that the past did not require the future's silence, that a heart could hold 2 things and not split. "Eleanor," he said, "they are waiting for you downstairs." "Let them wait. Your mother will not permit this." "My mother," he said, and his voice was low and level, and carried the particular authority of a man who had been a duke since the age of 19, and who had permitted his mother's arrangements for precisely as long as they did not touch the things he had decided to protect. "Does not choose for me. She has never chosen for me. She chose for the man she believed I was. That man would have married Lady Cecilia. I am not that man." He crossed the room. He stood before her at the pianoforte and looked at her. And his hand, which had lived at his breast pocket for 2 years, moved from the letter to the space between them, and stopped. "Come downstairs with me," he said. "I cannot." "You can." "Edmund." His name in her mouth. The first time she had used it. His jaw tightened. His hand, the one that had stopped between them, closed once and opened. "Come downstairs," he said again. And it was a command. And it was protection. And she stood because her body had always known what her mind would not permit. And she took his arm. And they walked together down the staircase and into the ballroom where 300 guests and a dowager duchess and a woman in white pearls stood in the silence that the orchestra had not yet filled. The room saw them. The room understood. The dowager's hand, which had been resting on the back of a gilt chair, gripped the wood so hard that her knuckles whitened. Lady Cecilia's smile did not fall. It rearranged itself into something smaller and harder. The expression of a woman who was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that being told you are the correct choice is not the same as being chosen. Edmund Ashworth, the 5th Duke of Thornfield, stood in the center of his own ballroom with Eleanor Hartwell's hand on his arm and looked at the assembled season, and when he spoke, his voice carried the way stone carries sound, without heat and without apology. "I am engaged to Miss Hartwell." 5 words. The sentence fell into the silence like a key turned in a lock. No preamble, no explanation, no paragraph of declaration. 5 words. Specific, procedural, irrevocable. The candlelight did not flicker. The orchestra did not play. 300 people stood in the held breath of a room that had just been reorganized, and for a span of several seconds, the only sound was the faint creak of the parquet beneath the Duke's weight as he shifted his stance to place himself more squarely beside the woman whose hand rested on his arm. The dowager opened her mouth and closed it. Her posture, which had been the posture of command for 30 years, shifted backward by half an inch, and that half inch was the largest distance she had ever seated in a room she owned. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her face, in the candlelight, performed the slow recognition of a woman who had arranged the world around a son she had not troubled to see clearly, and who was seeing him now, too late, and finding that the man she had believed she governed had governed himself all along. Lady Cecilia's mother touched her daughter's arm. Lady Cecilia lowered her head. When she raised it, her eyes were bright and her mouth was firm, and she inclined her head toward Eleanor with a courtesy so precise it might have been rehearsed. "Miss Hartwell," she said, "I wish you well." She turned and walked toward the terrace doors. Her mother followed, The crowd watched them go. And then the crowd turned back to the Duke and the woman in the gray gown, and the murmur that moved through the room was not the murmur of scandal. It was the murmur of recognition. 300 faces adjusting their understanding of a man they thought they knew, and of a woman they had decided not to see. Mrs. Linford, the old housekeeper, stood near the service door at the back of the ballroom, and she was weeping. Not loudly, not for show, simply because she had watched the music room fill with Tuesday mornings and snowdrops and white roses, and a sound that the house had not held since the year the mistress died, and because she had known before anyone, before even the Duke himself, that the woman who played the country air was not a visitor. She was a returning. Frances found Eleanor in the crowd and took her hand and squeezed it and said nothing, because Frances was a woman who understood that some moments require only a hand held. The ball continued. Edmund danced. For the first time in 3 years, the Duke of Thornfield danced. He danced with Eleanor. One dance, a slow country measure that required nothing more than hands touching and bodies moving in parallel, and eyes that did not look away. The other couples on the floor gave them room, the way a crowd gives room to something it recognizes as private, even in a public space. Eleanor's hand in his was steady. Her heart was not. She could feel his pulse through the thin leather of their gloves, or she imagined she could, and the distinction between sensation and imagination had ceased to matter somewhere between the first step and the turn at the end of the line. The room watched them, and the room saw what the room had failed to see for the duration of the season, which was that a woman in a turned gown whose shoes sat unevenly and whose dance card had never been marked was, in this light, in this man's gaze, in this particular arrangement of music and candlelight and the plain truth of a body that had crossed a room for her, beautiful. Thornfield in June was green and quiet and smelled of cut grass and the roses that climbed the south wall of the house. Eleanor arrived on a Saturday. In the carriage Edmund had sent for her, with a trunk that contained the gray gown and 3-day dresses, and her mother's miniature, and very little else. Mrs. Linford met her at the front door and showed her to a room on the 2nd floor. Not the music room, but a bedroom beside it, with windows that faced the south garden where the snowdrops came up in January. That evening, after a supper at which the Dowager was notably absent, and Frances and Mr. Crawley sat across the table looking variously delighted and confused, Eleanor went to the music room and sat at the Broadwood and played The Country Air, her mother's song. The notes filled the room and moved through the open door into the corridor where Edmund stood, as he had stood on that first Tuesday, with his hand against the doorframe. He came in this time. He sat in the chair near the window, and he reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the folded letter. Margaret's handwriting on the outside, faded now, the creases worn to softness. He looked at the letter for a long moment. Then he rose and crossed to the writing desk in the corner of the room and opened the small drawer and placed the letter inside and closed the drawer gently. "She would have liked you," he said. Eleanor's hands paused on the keys. She looked at him, and his face was quiet, and the ice was gone, and what remained was the man beneath it, grave and tender, and marked by the particular courage of a person who had carried a grief against his chest and had chosen not to set it down, for grief is not a thing a person sets down, but to make room beside it. "Play," he said. "Please." She played. The music moved through the room and through the open window into the evening air, where the roses climbed and the south garden held the last of the light. Edmund sat near the pianoforte. His hand rested on the instrument's edge, close to hers, not quite touching. The room held them both. Outside, the first stars of the summer appeared above Thornfield, and the house, which had been silent for 2 years and 4 months, was no longer silent. It was full. Thank you for staying until the end. If Eleanor's story moved you, a quiet word in the comments would mean more than you know.